Iwo Jima, February 22, 1945. Corporal Robert Dunlap of the 28th Marine Regiment moves cautiously up a rocky slope east of Mount Suribachi. His senses are on high alert, every muscle tense, his eyes scanning the rugged volcanic terrain ahead. He knows that any rock, any hole, any fissure in the stone could hide a Japanese soldier with a ready rifle, prepared to fire as soon as his face appears above the line of sight. The air smells of sulfur, gunpowder, and fear. His feet sink into the fine volcanic sand that swallows every step. He moves inch by inch, each movement calculated, each breath controlled. Then, without warning, the silence is broken by a single shot. One of his comrades falls, the sound of his body hitting the ground almost inaudible over the roar of distant cannons. Dunlap doesn't see where the shot came from. There is no puff of smoke indicating the sniper's position, no movement in the rocky landscape. It's as if the island itself fired at them. This is the daily nightmare for the Marines on Iwo Jima, a battlefield where the enemy is invisible until the moment you are dead. The Battle of Iwo Jima was unlike any other in the Pacific Theater. While on other islands, the Japanese defended the coastline with suicidal fury, on Iwo Jima, under the command of General Kuribayashi, they adopted a revolutionary strategy that turned every foot of the island into a death trap. Kuribayashi, who had spent time in the United States as a military attaché and fully understood American industrial power, knew he could not win a war of attrition. Strategy was designed to make every yard cost American blood. As he wrote in his guidelines for junior officers in August 1944, "We will not die in suicidal attacks. Each man will inflict 10 casualties on the enemy before dying. Dig deep positions. Fire from the protection of pillboxes. Do not expose your positions." This order, revolutionary for Japanese military doctrine at the time, set the tone for one of the most relentless defenses in the history of warfare. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima, with its rugged and rocky terrain, was the perfect setting for this innovative defensive strategy. Kuribayashi oversaw the construction of more than 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, though some historians estimate the system may have reached 18 miles. These tunnels, carved into the soft volcanic rock known as tuff, allowed Japanese soldiers to move, resupply, and counterattack without being seen. The true genius of the defense lay in the individual firing positions, more than 5,000 of them, that were carefully integrated into the natural terrain. Every rock, every hole, every fissure in the rugged volcanic landscape was transformed into an ambush position. Major General Grav B. Erskine, commander of the 3rd Marine Division, would later describe, "It was like fighting the island itself. You never knew where the next shot would come from because the Japanese could pop up anywhere." For the American Marines, every step on Iwo Jima was a deadly lottery. Lieutenant John J. Bradley, a combat medic who would later become one of the flag raisers on Mount Suribachi, would write, "Never before had we faced an enemy who refused to be seen. On other islands, you could spot the enemy positions, plan an attack. On Iwo Jima, every rock could hide a sniper, every hole could hold a machine gun. You'd advance, take a position, and the next morning the Japanese were back, as if the earth had spit them back out." This experience created a constant state of tension that wore down the mental endurance of the American soldiers just as much as the enemy's bullets wore down their ranks. The Japanese defense system was meticulously planned to maximize the effectiveness of every soldier. Kuribayashi positioned his forces not on the coastline, as the Americans expected, but on the high ground in the island's interior, where they had interlocking fields of fire over the landing beaches. Mount Suribachi, at the southern tip, was transformed into an underground fortress with over 500 firing positions. But the real challenge began after Suribachi's capture, when the Marines advanced to the northern part of the island. There, in areas like Hill 382 and the place known as the Meat Grinder, every foot of the rugged terrain was carefully prepared for defense. Captain Dave Severance of Easy Company, 28th Marines, would recall, "It was as if every inch of the island was cursed. You'd advance, take a position, and the next morning the Japanese were back, as if the earth had spit them back out." The key to the effectiveness of the Japanese positions was their seamless integration with the volcanic terrain. Japanese soldiers were trained to use every natural feature of the island to their advantage. Irregular volcanic rocks were turned into natural pillboxes. Fissures in the rock became sniper nests. Holes in the volcanic sand concealed machine guns. The result was that the American Marines could never be sure where the next shot would come from. Sergeant Fred Boots Thomas, a Marine who earned his nickname because his boots were constantly filled with sand, would write, "You could pass a boulder 1,000 times with no problem, and on the 1,001st time, a Japanese soldier would shoot from inside it." They had a way of melting into the landscape that was terrifying. This strategy created a devastating psychological dynamic. The Marines, trained for open-field combat, found themselves in an environment where the enemy was invisible until the moment of attack. Lieutenant Robert Howard, who led several reconnaissance patrols, would describe, "It was the most unbearable tension. You never knew if you were safe, even when you weren't shooting. It was like fighting ghosts." This constant tension led to a phenomenon known as phantom sniper syndrome, where Marines would often open fire on inanimate objects they believed to be enemies. Major General Harry Schmidt, commander of the Expeditionary Force, would later report, "Exhaustion was responsible for more casualties than many enemy weapons. Men would simply fall asleep while walking, exposed to enemy fire." The night brought little relief. While the Marines expected the traditional nightly banzai counterattacks, Kuribayashi had forbidden these suicidal charges, considering them a waste of soldiers. Instead, the Japanese used the nights to move silently through the tunnels, infiltrating American lines to throw grenades or simply to observe. Captain Severance would recall, "It was the most unbearable tension. You never knew if you were safe, even when you weren't shooting. It was like fighting ghosts." This war of pinpricks strategy kept the Americans in a constant state of alert, denying them the vital rest needed for physical and mental recovery. The most effective Japanese tactic was the use of coordinated ambushes. They positioned snipers in strategic locations along likely American routes of advance, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned every movement into a death trap. Sergeant Jim Lane, a Marine who survived the battle, would describe, "They had a way of making us advance exactly where they wanted us. You'd think you were following a safe route, and suddenly, shots would come from 3 different directions. It was as if they knew exactly where we were before we even knew." These ambushes were often preceded by diversionary shots, a single shot from an isolated sniper that drew the Americans' attention in one direction, while the main attack came from another. The accuracy of the Japanese snipers was frightening. Trained to conserve ammunition in a theater of war where supplies were limited, every shot counted. Lieutenant Bradley would write, "They didn't waste shots. Every shot had a purpose. Sometimes you'd hear a single shot and a man would fall. No firefight, no burst of fire, just one dead man. It was as if the island itself had decided to kill him." This lethal precision was particularly effective against officers and combat medics who wore visible insignia of their roles. The result was a disproportionate casualty rate among unit leaders and medical personnel, which further undermined the effectiveness of the American units. The Japanese defense also benefited from an intimate knowledge of the terrain. The soldiers who built the fortifications had spent months living on the island, learning every rock, every hole, every feature of the land. Captain Suribachi, Kuribayashi's staff officer, would later describe, "Every curve, every fork, every ramp was designed to maximize our defense and minimize the effectiveness of American weapons." This familiarity with the terrain allowed the Japanese to move with confidence in complete darkness, while the Americans stumbled and hesitated. Sergeant Lane would describe, "They knew every rock like the palms of their hands. They could move in complete darkness, while we needed flashlights that made us easy targets." The Japanese tunnel system created a tactical nightmare for the Americans. The Marines quickly discovered that simply bypassing a bunker was not an option. The Japanese would just reappear behind them, cutting supply and communication lines. The only solution was what they called cave cleaning, a slow, dangerous, and grueling process that involved throwing smoke grenades, blasting with M2 flamethrowers, and sometimes plugging entrances with explosives. Flamethrower operator Robert Sherrod would describe, "Every bunker was a battle in itself. You never knew how many were inside or if they were armed with grenades. It was a deadly lottery." The flamethrower operators, in particular, faced a terrible fate. as they were priority targets for the Japanese defenders. The experience in the Iwo Jima tunnels was particularly terrifying. Sergeant Lane, who participated in several tunnel-clearing operations, would describe, "It was like walking into hell. The hot, humid air hit us first, followed by the smell, sweat, excrement, burnt ammunition, and something worse, something rotten. Then, total darkness. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face." The Marines had to advance backwards, with the point man using a flamethrower or throwing grenades ahead, knowing that any turn could hide a deadly ambush. Claustrophobia was a constant problem, with many men panicking and having to be dragged out. The Japanese also used the tunnel system to move silently behind American lines, launching surprise attacks at night. Lieutenant Howard would write, "You'd think you had secured an area, and the next morning, the Japanese were back, as if they'd sprung from nowhere. It was as if the whole island was alive, spewing enemies from every crack." This ability to reappear after being defeated undermined American morale and created a sense of helplessness. The battle reached its climax on March 26, 1945, when General Kuribayashi led his own final attack. It was not a traditional banzai charge, but a night infiltration operation with his last 300 men. Even in death, he maintained his tactical conviction. His body was never identified, the final anonymity for the man who rejected traditional glory. The attack was a tactical failure, but symbolically significant. It showed that to the very end, Kuribayashi refused to follow traditional Japanese doctrine. The result was a battle of attrition without precedent. While statistics from other Pacific battles showed a 5-to-1 casualty ratio in favor of the Americans, 5 Japanese killed for every American. On Iwo Jima, the ratio was 1.2-to-1. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner during the 36 days of active combat. On the American side, the casualties were shocking: 6,821 killed and over 19,000 wounded. As General Holland Smith, commander of the Marine Corps, would later observe, "I don't know if taking Iwo Jima was strategically necessary, but I do know it was the bloodiest battle our men ever participated in." The deepest lesson of Iwo Jima is that in any conflict, the integration of man with the terrain can be as decisive as numerical or technological superiority. The battle was won not just by American endurance, but by the Japanese inability to indefinitely sustain their underground defense. General Kuribayashi had underestimated the logistical needs for a prolonged defense, and the intensity of combat accelerated the consumption of supplies. Captain Wache recorded in his diary, "Rations were calculated to last 3 months of siege, but we consumed them in 6 weeks due to the intensity of combat. Now we are reduced to a quarter of a rice cracker per man per day." 75 years later, Iwo Jima remains a monument to the horror of modern war. The statistics tell part of the story: 36 days of combat, 6,821 Americans killed, 19,000 wounded, 21,000 Japanese killed. But the numbers don't capture the essence of the hell the Marines faced. A battlefield where every rock, every hole, every fissure in the rock could hide a Japanese soldier with a ready rifle, prepared to fire as soon as your face appeared above the line of sight. Today, when we study Iwo Jima, we must remember not only the heroes who raised the flag on Suribachi, but the thousands of men on both sides who fought on a battlefield where the enemy was invisible until the moment you were dead. These are the true heroes of Iwo Jima's history, not those who sought glory, but those who persisted despite the hell beneath their feet and all around them. The most enduring lesson of Iwo Jima is that, even in the most technologically advanced warfare, the ability of ordinary men to endure extreme conditions, the enemy who is never seen until it's too late, the constant tension that wears down the mind as much as bullets wear down the body, remains the true measure of courage. And on Iwo Jima, that courage was tested like in no other place in World War II.